Welcome back to the Wine School, and this week we're taking a run through the Rhone Valley from north to south. Now, France is mainly divided into three areas: northern France, central and southern France, but I think it's more useful to think of southern France as Mediterranean France because it is decisively different, and it's in the Rhone Valley that this area crosses from central France into Mediterranean France in the most noticeable way in the landscape, and it's reflected in the wines as well. The northern Rhone Valley is a continuation of the geological fault we looked at last time in Burgundy, with the Massif Central and the Alps essentially pulling the continent apart and creating this valley, along with glacial erosion in the past and flooding, and this gives the area its geological character that's reflected in the wines. In the north, the vineyards are mainly based on granite, particularly the hills of Côte-Rôtie and Hermitage, and in the south it's mainly alluvial deposits from the glacial erosion and the repeated flooding in this area. So you've got two distinctive types of soil in both areas. It was the Greeks and later the Romans who first brought the vine to this area. The Romans in particular, they had a 600-year tenure in the area when the empire was quite stable, and this really informed the way the vine found its home in this area. It's also reflected in the fact that the biggest concentration of Roman ruins and relics are found in this area, more so than anywhere outside of Italy. The standout white wine in the northern Rhone is Condrieu. This is made from the Vineyard grape, and there is also a sub-region of Chateau Grillet, which has an appellation of all of its own for this one small vineyard. Vineyard has a lovely sort of apricot intensity, lovely honeysuckle character to it. It's a really lovely wine. Other white wines are made across the northern Rhone, mainly from basic Côte de Rhône white right up to Hermitage Blanc, usually from Marsanne and Roussanne. Marsanne's generally more nutty and textured, Roussanne's a little bit more aromatic, not quite as much as Vineyard, but all of these make white wines at the fuller bodied, almost oily end of the scale. These aren't light, sort of quaffing wines. Now, the first one we're trying today is Domaine de Montelet from Stéphane Montes, and it's the Haute de Montiet. This isn't Condrieu, it's from vineyards across the northern Rhone. There's also a little bit of Marsanne, Roussanne and Claret in here as well. So if we taste this first white, the first thing that leaps out is what I already mentioned about Vineyard. It's that lovely apricot character, a lovely floral character too. Honeysuckle I mentioned, lots of white sort of peach blossom in there. I always think Vineyard is very much about stone fruits of apricot, peach. There's also a little whiff of oak in there as well. It's had a little bit of time in oak, just to give it a little bit more structure. And on the palate, it's got that lovely texture of Vineyard. It's almost like a peach skin, if you think of the fuzz on a peach. It's got a lovely sort of texture in the mouth. It's not tannins, but it's almost got that sort of tannin character, quite grippy. This is a lovely seafood wine. This would work really well with something a little bit richer like lobster, or even chicken and pork dishes. I actually had this wine with an Elizabethan pork dish with prunes, and it really stood up to those strong flavours. Really good food wine. As we head south from Condrieu, the vineyards sort of turn into Saint-Joseph, which goes all the way down the western bank of the Rhône. Now this is an area where there are some superb wines produced, but it's quite a big area and it has been allowed to expand, I would argue, beyond its sort of intrinsic quality. There's some great wines, but there's also some slightly uneven wines from this area, all under the name of Saint-Joseph. So it's worth looking out for a good producer such as Guigal, Chapoutier, Domaine de Montiet to make some really good reds from this area as well. So again, it's worth looking out for the right producer from some of these areas. On the eastern side of the river, we have the Hill of Hermitage and the broader area around it of Creuse Hermitage. Now the Hill of Hermitage is a granite outcrop similar to that we saw further north in Côte-Rôtie. Here the river just happened to go around the other side, which is why it's on the eastern side of the river. But most importantly, it's facing south, so it gets that all-important sunshine. The Syrah here is not blended with Vineyard. It's all about 100% Syrah, and the wines have a real structure and power to them. So much so that in the early days, Bordeaux wines, which could be a little bit thin in some vintages, were regularly beefed up with some Syrah from Hermitage. They literally called it hermitaging the wine to give it more body, which demonstrates just how different these wines are from those from further north. On the Hill of Hermitage, there are various different vineyards or climats. So those from further down are naturally warmer, fuller-bodied wines. Those from further up the slope tend to be a little bit lighter, more fragrant. Most of them are blended, but we're starting to see a few sort of single vineyard bottlings, most famously Jabelet's Hermitage La Chapelle. But what we have here is from lower down on the slopes. Crozes Hermitage. We're going to be tasting a Crozes Hermitage Les Jalets from a really good producer, Jaboulet, next. Here we've got, starting to smell sort of bramble and blackcurrant, real sort of inky intensity to the wine. Lovely acidity, but all held together with that beautiful brambly, plum, blackcurrant character. There's a lot of fruit in this wine. It doesn't quite have the power of a Hermitage, but for a fraction of the price, this is much better than many Crozes Hermitages you would find on the market. The problem with Crozes Hermitage often is that it's produced by cooperatives or less well-regarded producers, because it is a bit like Saint-Joseph, one of those areas that's perhaps a little bit bigger than it should be, which is why it's worth picking out the best producers like Jaboulet, Guigard, JL Chave is another one worth looking out for. One of the problems with the cooperative wines is they account for one cooperative alone. The Cave de Tan accounts for about 50% of the production. Perfectly decent wine, you can pick them up in the UK for about a tenner. It's perfectly nice, but I don't think it's really fair for that to be Crozes Hermitage, and this too. I think this is definitely a cut above. Although it's a lovely wine for drinking on its own, it's got a lovely suppleness to it. This I think works really well with food. Lamb and beef obviously, but I think it works really well with game, particularly when it gets a little bit of bottle age. It starts to take on those gamey characteristics, and I think this would work really well with venison, particularly if it's cooked rare. In the 1920s, the first quality controls were put in place by the local vignerons around sort of vineyard size, yield, number of vines per hectare, that kind of thing. And this sort of coalesced into what is now the Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée laws, which apply across the whole of France. But it started here in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and it's been quality conscious ever since. Another little oddity, a local bylaw that is actually still in the statute books, is flying saucers, known in French as cigares volants, are actually prohibited from landing on the vineyards of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. But I can't help but feel that this is a little bit more shameless self-promotion from the local mayor rather than any actual fear of little green men. The dominant grape in the south is Grenache, along with Syrah, Mourvèdre, and up to 13 varieties are permitted for use in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, for example. But more commonly, there's no hard and fast rule, but more commonly Grenache is at least 50% of the blend in any of the wines in this area, with a few exceptions. But here, Grenache, its chocolatey richness is the hallmark of southern Côte de Rhône and the Cru vineyards. Now, the vineyard classification in the Rhône is Côte de Rhône Village, which is slightly a step up, and then Côte de Rhône Village, and then with a specific village name appended on the end of it. Now, there's only a certain number of villages that are allowed to use this name. Some of them can just use Côte de Rhône Village, but if you have your name at the end of it, it's the next step up in the quality level. For example, up until 2015, Côte de Rhône Village Cairan, and then from 2016 onwards, Cairan was elevated to full cru status, so along with Châteauneuf-du-Pape, Baccarats, Lirac, and so forth. So now it just says Appellation Cairan on the label rather than Côte de Rhône Village, and that's the top of the quality tree, the cru status for all of those, starting with Châteauneuf-du-Pape and all the others that have followed on since. Some of the other more recently elevated cru are Vin Sobre, Rasteau, Baccarats, and Baume de Venise. Now, Baume de Venise you probably know better for Muscat de Baume de Venise, which has cru status for its sweet wine, Muscat de Baume de Venise, but it now also applies to red wine, which are less well known, but again, worth seeking out, really interesting wines. Now, just a quick mention of Muscat de Baume de Venise. It is what's called a vin doux naturel, that's naturally sweet wine, and it's made in a similar way to lots of these sweet red or white wines, which is the addition of grape spirit during fermentation, which halts the fermentation because the yeast dies, and the residual sweetness gives you a naturally sweet wine. Muscat de Baume de Venise is well worth seeking out if you haven't tried it. It's a lovely wine, really nice on its own or with sorbet or a light fruit dessert. Rasteau actually has an AOC for a similar vin doux naturel made from Grenache Noir, a red one. This is one that is less and less common, and I would argue it's not worth seeking out. If you're looking for an interesting red wine like that, I would look further south in Banyuls and Maury. They're definitely worth seeking out, and much more interesting wines. Tivel is another AOC. It's unusual in that only rosé is permitted, apparently by papal decree back in the day, but it now is still only rosé is permitted. It's from the same grapes that you'd find further south in Provence, so Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre. But unlike the Provence rosés, although it's dry, it has a slightly fuller body, a little bit more minerality, a little bit more breadth. A really interesting rosé, and well worth seeking out. It's at the expensive end, but it's more, I would say, more of a wine for drinking with food rather than a Provence rosé, which you just sort of snack on or just drink on its own. It's quite a light, inoffensive wine. Another little area that you might not be familiar with is Grignan-les-Aldemars, which used to be called Côte de Tricastin, which might be a name you're a little more familiar with. That was phased out because unfortunately the nuclear reactor in the area, the Tricastin reactor, had a few issues with leakage and dumping. So the local vignerons actually petitioned to have the area's name changed. So because they're well known, again, they might be worth seeking out because they're not sort of on people's radar. So again, it's more one of those more interesting areas that is, again, up and coming. A good example of the reds from this area, though, from one of the main crus just to the east of the Rhône in the south, is Baccarats, and this one is from Domaine de Garrigue. The domain's name is actually chosen to reflect the character in the area, this Garrigue that I mentioned before, and that sort of resinous, slightly herby, almost woody smell you can sometimes pick up in the wines as well, particularly when they've got a little bit of bottle age. Now here you've got a little bit more depth of colour than the Hermitage from further north. And I would argue a little bit more depth on the nose. It's slightly plummier, slightly darker fruit, so damson rather than plum, if you think of it that way. And again, a little bit more richness and spiciness. There's plenty of acidity there, but there's a little bit more heat coming through from the alcohol. The alcohol level's high. The Creux Hermitage is 13.5. This I would expect to be higher, and indeed it's 15%. So it's quite a jump in alcohol. So from only about 60 kilometres between the two. There's a little bit of spiciness on the end also from a little bit of oak aging. There's a little bit of vanilla coming through, but most of it is just that richness of fruit coming through. And again, that little bit of heat from the alcohol. The majority of the best vineyards in the southern Rhone are to the east of the river. Baccarats, Gigondas, Baume de Venise, Rasteau to the north. There's all kinds of different soils and altitude. The wines of Rasteau, even though they're right next to Baccarats, they have a slightly different character, a little bit lighter, more minerality, and that's because thousands of years ago there was an eruption below the tectonic plate, and it pushed some of the vineyards of what are now the vineyards of Rasteau up a little bit higher, and it pushed the limestone to the surface. So even though it's not obvious from above, the subsoil of the vineyards are quite different in the two areas, which is why you have that marked difference in style. And that's just one example of the lots of different reasons these different patchworks of vineyards and their different geologies inform the way the wines are made, and gives the area that real interest in the difference between the different cru. Although at the top end, some Rhone wines are very expensive. You know, collectors buy them, they're the darlings of auction houses. I would argue there's still better value to be had in the Rhone than, for example, in Bordeaux or particularly Burgundy. They're not quite attracting the same prices at the top end, and I think although the gap between the top end and the bottom end in terms of price has never been wider, in terms of quality it's getting closer together. So at this sort of mid-price range, I think the Rhone is some of the best value wines available from France, and some of the most versatile and food-friendly wines as well. It's an interesting area, but it's also an area where there's a lot more satisfaction to be had, I think, from Burgundy in particular. Although it has some of the best wines in the world, it can disappoint, and I've rarely been disappointed with Rhone, from the cheaper end to the medium end, and even right at the top end. They're great wines across the board. Further south from the main cru of the Rhone, you have to the east the Côte de Ventoux, which is going up Mount Ventoux, which is probably better known to cyclists who attempt it every year, particularly the Tour de France, but it's a real mecca for cycling. But the wines from here are gaining recognition. At the Côte de Luberon, again, it's an area that produces some interesting wines, not quite as good as those at the heart of the Rhone Valley, but they're really getting better year on year. And as the Rhone Delta fans further out, it sort of heads into Provence and then to Languedoc-Roussillon towards the west. And these are wines from these areas that I think are made in broadly similar style. And again, they're worth looking out for because although they can't command the same price or the same quality as these wines from the centre, again, they're making some really interesting wines in the same mould and same style as these. So I hope this has piqued your interest for this area and you explore it a little bit further. And we look forward to seeing you again next time.